was sitting at his desk, the office lit only by the dim light of the monitor in front of him. Night had already fallen, but he couldn't stop thinking about the disappearances that had become the main headline of the last few days. Something about the pattern bothered him, a feeling that there was more than met the eye. At first, it all seemed random, people disappearing without a trace, with no apparent connection between them. But Louis knew that when something seemed meaningless, that's where the scariest answers usually lurked. He looked through the notes scattered on the table. Old newspaper clippings, police reports, anonymous emails that had come into his hands. Nothing seemed to fit until one word jumped out at him: hidden. It was a small, barely noticeable note in a local newspaper dating back decades. It talked about a sect that performed secret rituals at midnight in abandoned places on the outskirts of the city. There weren't many details, just vague reports from residents who claimed to have heard strange chants and seen mysterious lights on full moon nights. Louis leaned back in his chair, thinking. In his career as an investigative journalist, he had come across many bizarre stories, but something about that mention of the cult moved him in a different way. Was there a connection between it and the recent disappearances? And if so, why hadn't anyone else noticed? Determined to follow this new lead, Louis began to dig deeper. He typed the name of the cult into the search engine, but the results were scarce, almost non-existent. It was as if the cult had disappeared from the collective memory, erased by the passage of time. This only increased his curiosity. He knew that the best-kept secrets were those that no one else was looking for. After a few hours of fruitless searching, Louis finally found something. An obscure, almost forgotten forum where a few people discussed conspiracy theories and local mysteries. One of the threads was dedicated to the Midnight Cult. The posts were old, most of them dating back more than a decade, but the descriptions were disturbing. People talked about a sect that performed rituals for unknown purposes, always in abandoned places, away from prying eyes. Some posts mentioned that those who tried to investigate further ended up mysteriously disappearing. One of the posts caught Louis' attention. An anonymous user claimed to have found one of the locations used by the cult, an abandoned mansion in the woods on the outskirts of the city. He described it as a place of pure evil, where the air seemed heavy and the darkness was almost tangible. The post ended with a clear warning: "Don't go there alone. If you value your life, forget you read this." Louis knew he was getting into something dangerous, but the idea of giving up now was unacceptable. He wrote down the address mentioned in the post and decided that he would go to the mansion the following evening. If there was any connection between the cult and the recent disappearances, that was the best starting point to find out. As he closed his laptop and prepared to leave, an uncomfortable feeling settled in his stomach. Something told him that this investigation wasn't going to be like the others. There was a chill running down his spine, an intuition he couldn't ignore. Louis was about to dive into an ancient and dangerous mystery, but at the same time, he knew he had no choice. Whatever was going on, he needed to find out the truth, even if it meant putting himself at risk. With one last glance at the newspaper clippings and notes on his desk, Louis switched off the office light and left, the determination on his face marked by the shadow of uncertainty. The investigation had begun, and the first step was about to be taken in the darkness of the night. The full moon was high in the sky when Louis arrived at the abandoned mansion. The night air was freezing, and the wind howled through the trees, creating a sound that sent Louis' nerves jangling. He parked the car a safe distance away, hidden among the shadows of the trees, and continued on foot towards the imposing structure that rose up in front of him. The mansion looked like something out of a nightmare. Its stone walls were covered in moss. The broken windows were like empty eyes, watching him as he approached. The building had an almost oppressive presence, as if time itself had given up on keeping it intact. Louis stopped for a moment, staring at the place, feeling a shiver run down his spine. "Don't go there alone," The words of the forum post echoed in his mind, but Louis pushed the hesitation aside. He had come this far to find out the truth, and this was no time to turn back. With a flashlight in hand and his heart racing, he entered the mansion. The inside was even darker than the outside. The smell of mold and decay filled the air, and the silence was interrupted only by the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. Louis advanced cautiously, lighting the way ahead of him. The walls were covered in old, faded wallpaper, torn in several places, exposing the rotten wood underneath. He passed a large staircase leading to the upper floor, but decided to continue on the first floor, following his intuition. As he explored the rooms of the mansion, Louis began to notice strange symbols carved into the walls and floor. They were intricate designs, which he couldn't identify, but which emanated a sense of unease. They seemed to tell a story, but one he couldn't fully understand. Each symbol seemed to be connected to the next, like parts of a puzzle that he had to put together. Finally, after exploring several empty rooms, Louis found what he was looking for. Opening a large double door at the end of a corridor, he entered a room that looked as if it had been used recently. The stone floor was marked with the same kind of symbols he had seen before, but here they were sharper and clearly drawn with some kind of dark paint. In the center of the room, there was a makeshift altar covered in spent candles, some still burning, their flames gently swaying in the breeze that came in through the broken windows. Louis approached cautiously, trying to take in every detail. On the altar was an old book, its pages yellowed by time. The letters on the cover were in a language he couldn't decipher, but the book exuded an aura of mystery and power that made him hesitate before touching it. When he finally plucked up the courage to open the book, he was surprised by a sound. Footsteps. Someone was approaching. Louis quickly switched off his flashlight and hid behind a nearby pillar, watching with his heart in his throat. 2 men and a woman entered the room. They were dressed in black robes, their faces covered by hoods, and began to prepare the place for what appeared to be a ritual. They lit more candles around the altar and began chanting in a language Louis didn't recognize. Their voices were low, almost hypnotic, and the rhythm of their singing added to the feeling that something sinister was about to happen. Louis stood there, motionless, trying to understand what was happening. The words he heard were incomprehensible, but the tone and intention behind them were clear. This was an invocation, a plea to something or someone. The air in the room seemed to become heavier, charged with a dense energy that made the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. As the cult members began to surround the altar, Louis realized that he had to get out of there before he was discovered. But how? Any false move could give away his presence. He kept quiet, waiting for the right moment to escape. But then one of the cult members stopped abruptly, as if he had sensed something. He raised his head, and although Louis couldn't see his face, he felt his penetrating gaze piercing through the darkness. The silence that followed was terrifying, and for a moment, Louis was sure he had been discovered. The cult member took a few steps towards Louis, and he braced himself for the worst. But before he could be found, a strong gust of wind came through the broken window, blowing out some of the candles and distracting the cultists. Seizing the opportunity, Louis quietly slipped away, making his way around the room to the door through which he had entered. When he was a few meters from the exit, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, a low, husky laugh from behind him. He didn't dare look back. Instead, he ran out of the room as quietly as possible, feeling the cultists' gaze following him through the shadows. As soon as he left the mansion and reached the safety of the trees, Louis stopped to catch his breath. His heart was beating frantically and his hands were shaking. He knew he had seen something far beyond a simple ceremony. What he had witnessed was only the tip of the iceberg, and what lay beneath was something much deeper and more dangerous. Back in the car, Louis realized that the investigation was far from over. He needed to understand more about what this sect was doing and how it was linked to the recent disappearances. But at the same time, a feeling of dread consumed him. The cultists knew he had been there, and he had the uncomfortable impression that they would not stand idly by. With one last glance at the mansion, which was now a menacing silhouette in the moonlight, Louis got into his car and drove off, certain that that night had changed everything. He was in a very dangerous game, and the rules were still far from clear. In the days that followed the night in the abandoned mansion, Louis couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time he looked over his shoulder, he had the impression that someone was watching him. Every unexpected sound startled him, and he found himself constantly checking doors and windows, making sure they were locked. At first, he tried to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. After all, what he had witnessed that night in the mansion was enough to make anyone nervous. But it soon became impossible to ignore the signs. The first clear indication that he was being followed came while he was driving home one evening. The headlights of a car behind him appeared in the rear-view mirror and stayed there, following him down several streets, keeping the same distance. Louis tried to shake it off, turning corners unpredictably, but the car continued behind him like a persistent shadow. When it finally stopped in front of his building, the car drove straight past, but something about the way the headlights went out just ahead on the street sent a chill down Louis' spine. He quickly entered the house, locking the door behind him, and decided not to think about it again that night. But the discomfort persisted, like an invisible presence that wouldn't leave him alone. The next morning, when Louis went out to get the newspaper, he found something that made his heart race. At the front door, someone had left a small black box. It was plain and unmarked, but the fact that it had been left directly on his doorstep was disturbing enough. He picked it up carefully and went back inside, his hands shaking slightly. Opening the box, he found a small folded piece of paper inside. As he unfolded it, he saw that it was covered in hasty but legible writing. "You've gone too far. Stop while you still can." The message was clear and direct. They knew who he was, where he lived, and were aware of his investigation. Louis felt a shiver run down his spine. The threat was real, and he was now on the cult's radar. But instead of being frightened, something inside him flared up. He knew that the only reason they were trying to intimidate him was because he was close to discovering something important, something they didn't want to come to light. Determined to continue, but aware that he needed to be more cautious, Louis began to take steps to protect himself. First, he made copies of all his notes and evidence and left them with a trusted friend, explaining that if anything happened to him, this information should be taken to the police. Then he began to vary his daily routes and timetables, trying to make any attempt to follow him more difficult. Even so, the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. The tension increased when he began to notice strange things in his personal life. Several emails that he had never sent appeared in his outbox, messages with threatening content addressed to himself. Friends and colleagues started receiving them too, messages full of misinformation and false allegations about him. Louis realized that the cult was trying to isolate him, to make him a suspicious and discredited person in the eyes of others, a classic intimidation technique. Paranoia began to affect his sleep. Frequent nightmares, in which he was chased by hooded figures, caused him to wake up in the middle of the night covered in sweat. Louis began to question his sanity. Was he really being followed, or was it all just a construct of his overloaded mind? The line between reality and paranoia was becoming increasingly blurred. It was then that he decided to try a risky move. If they were trying to intimidate and silence him, perhaps he could turn the tables and put pressure on them. Louis spent days gathering as much information as possible about the cult members. He discovered some names, old associations, and even rumors about local leaders. It was a dangerous move, but he decided to publish a small part of this information on his investigative blog, making it clear that he had more and was willing to use it if necessary. The response was almost immediate. That evening, on his way home, Louis found his door ajar. His heart raced as he advanced slowly, each step heavier than the last. As he pushed open the door, he found his apartment in disarray. Papers scattered, furniture overturned, but nothing of value seemed to have been taken. It was a message, crystal clear. They could get to him whenever they wanted. In the center of the room, on the table he used for work, was another box, identical to the previous one. This time, when he opened it, he found a small voice recorder. When he turned it on, a single phrase was played back, repeated several times in a cold, mechanical voice. "You are being watched." It was enough to make anyone give up. But for Louis, it only strengthened his resolve. He knew he was in dangerous territory, but he also knew he was getting close to the truth. Now, it was a question of surviving long enough to unmask whatever that cult was planning. With trembling hands, he pressed the recorder until the sound ceased. His breathing was heavy, but his mind was made up. The investigation couldn't stop. Not now. He would do whatever it took to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing the dangers that lurked in every shadow. Louis had no illusions about what lay ahead. He was in a fight against something much bigger and more sinister than he had imagined, but he was already too involved to back down. They might be watching, but he was watching them too, and he was ready to go all the way. Louis knew he was playing a dangerous game, but the feeling that he was getting closer to the truth was stronger than the fear. After what had happened in his apartment, it was clear that the cult not only knew about his investigation, but was willing to do anything to stop it. The threat was real, but Louis was determined not to be intimidated. Over the next few days, he redoubled his efforts to find out more about the cult. He spent hours in the library, going through old files and forgotten documents, trying to find any mention of the cult or its members. Every piece of information he found seemed to add more pieces to the puzzle, but something was missing to tie it all together. Then, one day, he received an anonymous message. The text was short and to the point. "I know what you're looking for. We need to meet. Tomorrow, 9 p.m. at the old warehouse on Baker Street. Come alone." Louis hesitated, but knew that this could be the opportunity he needed. The risk was great, but his intuition told him that this person had the answers he was looking for. The following evening, Louis went to the warehouse on Baker Street. The place was in ruins, an abandoned building that looked like it was about to collapse. The atmosphere was heavy, and the silence of the deserted street only added to his tension. He entered through the ajar door, and the smell of mold and decay hit him immediately. His footsteps echoed through the empty space as he advanced cautiously. At the back of the warehouse, a solitary figure was waiting. As he approached, Louis could see that it was a middle-aged man with a face marked by deep wrinkles and eyes that seemed to have seen more than they should have. He wore a dark coat and had a posture that indicated both tiredness and nervousness. "Are you Louis?" the man asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Louis nodded. "That's me. And who are you?" The man took a step forward, keeping his distance but leaving his face visible in the dim light coming through the broken windows. "My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I know. I was once part of the cult. I left before things got bad, but I know enough to know that you're in danger. They know who you are, and they won't stop until they silence you." Louis's heart beat faster. He was finally in front of someone who could give him answers. "What can you tell me about them? Why are they doing this? What is the purpose of the rituals?" The man looked around, as if making sure they were really alone. Then he took a deep breath before starting to speak. "This cult has been around longer than you think. They're not just some group of fanatics. They believe that through rituals they can connect with something ancient, something beyond our world. It's not just superstition. I've seen things I can't explain." Louis frowned. "Are you saying that they really believe they can summon something? A spirit? A demon?" The man shook his head slowly. "It's more than that. They believe they can open a door to another dimension, bring something into this world that should remain where it is. The disappearances you're investigating, they're not a coincidence. They are part of the rituals. Each person who has disappeared has been chosen for a reason. The cult believes that these people have a kind of energy that can fuel the invocation. Louis' mind raced to try and process what he was hearing. He had always suspected that there was something deeply disturbing behind the rituals, but hearing this confirmation, even in fragmentary form, made his skin crawl. And the people who disappear, are they dead? The man hesitated, and in his eyes, Louis saw the shadow of something deeper, something he was reluctant to reveal. Some, yes. Others were taken to another place. A place where the cult believes this entity resides. I don't know where, but the chances of them being alive are slim. The silence that followed was heavy. Louis knew he was dealing with something far beyond a simple criminal investigation. If what that man was saying was true, he was dealing with forces that defied rational comprehension. "Why did you leave?" Louis finally asked. The man looked away, clearly disturbed by the memory. "I saw what they were willing to do to achieve their goals. I saw people being sacrificed, disappearing without a trace. I knew that if I carried on, I'd be next. They don't accept defections. For them, you're either in or you're an enemy. I left while I still could, but I still live in the shadows, hiding from them." Louis looked at the man, realizing that he was as much a victim as he himself was becoming. "Why help me now?" The man smiled bitterly. "Because, unlike me, you have a chance to expose all this, to stop what they're doing before it's too late. I don't want anyone else to suffer like I did, but I need you to be careful. They're already watching you, and any false step could be your last." Louis felt the weight of responsibility fall on his shoulders. He couldn't give up now, not after having come so far. But he knew the danger was real and imminent. "How can I stop them? What do I need to do?" The man stepped forward, handing him an envelope. Inside are the names of some key cult members, locations they usually use, and some of the dates they plan to perform upcoming rituals. Use this information wisely. Go to the police or whoever you trust, but don't do it alone. They're more powerful than you think. Louis took the envelope carefully, feeling the rough paper against his skin. He thanked the man, knowing that he was risking everything by giving him this information. But before he could say anything else, the man gestured for him to leave. "Go now, before it's too late. And remember, don't trust anyone. Even those you think you know could be involved." Louis nodded and left the warehouse, the envelope safe in his hands. As the night enveloped him again, he couldn't help feeling that he had crossed an invisible line, a line that had no turning back. He was entering dangerous territory, where the supernatural and the real mixed in ways he had never imagined. As he walked quickly back to his car, the sound of the wind between the abandoned buildings sounded like whispers, reminding him that he was being watched. He knew that time was running out, and that he needed to act before the cult made its next move. The game of cat and mouse was about to reach a new level, and Louis knew that he only had one chance to get out of this alive, and to expose the dark truth that was about to be revealed. Louis felt the weight of the envelope in his pocket as he drove along the deserted road. The man's words echoed in his mind, each one charged with a desperate urgency. He knew he was nearing the end of his investigation, but he also felt he was entering dangerous territory, where a single false step could be fatal. The envelope the man had handed him was full of crucial information, names of cult members, places where rituals were performed, and, most importantly, the date and place of the next big ritual. The date was set for that evening, in a secluded spot on the outskirts of town, an old cemetery that had been abandoned for decades. Louis knew that this was his last chance to expose the sect and prevent more lives from being lost. He drove to the cemetery, his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind racing with possible scenarios. He had warned a trusted friend about his plan and left clear instructions in case anything went wrong. The police were out of the question. He knew that some cult members could be infiltrating the police force, and any false move could alert them. When he reached the cemetery, he parked the car a safe distance away and continued on foot. The night was cold, and the biting wind carried a strange silence, as if nature itself was waiting for what was about to happen. Louis felt a chill as he passed the rusty gates, which creaked slightly to the touch. The cemetery was vast, with ancient tombstones covered in moss and dry trees that looked like skeletal hands raised to the sky. Louis advanced carefully, keeping to the shadows, until he saw a light in the distance, glowing faintly in the darkness. He approached, his senses on high alert, and hid behind a thick tree to watch. In the center of the cemetery, in an open clearing, a group of hooded people were gathered around a large circle drawn on the ground with the same kind of symbols he had seen in the mansion. They were muttering chants in a strange language, and the air around them seemed to vibrate with an energy that Louis had never felt before. In the center of the circle was a stone altar, on which lay someone who appeared to be unconscious, the next victim. Louis felt his heart race as he realized the gravity of what was about to happen. There was no more time for hesitation. He had to act now, but he also knew that a direct approach would be suicidal. There were too many of them, and he was alone, with only a phone to record what he could and a small gun he carried for protection. Slowly, he took the phone out of his pocket and started recording, capturing every detail. The plan was simple. Get enough evidence to expose the cult to the world, and then, if possible, stop the ritual and save the victim. But as he watched, he began to realize that something was wrong. The air around the altar seemed to distort, as if an invisible force was manifesting itself. The shadows around the cult members seemed to take on a life of their own, extending beyond what logic allowed. Suddenly, one of the cultists raised his head, as if he had sensed Louis' presence. His heart raced. He had been discovered. Without thinking, he began to move silently to a new hiding place, but another cult member, closer to him, stepped forward, looking directly at the tree where he was. Slowly, he took the phone out of his pocket and started recording, capturing every detail. The plan was simple. Get enough evidence to expose the cult to the world, and then, if possible, stop the ritual and save the victim. But as he watched, he began to realize that something was wrong. The air around the altar seemed to distort, as if an invisible force was manifesting itself. The shadows around the cult members seemed to take on a life of their own, extending beyond what logic allowed. Suddenly, one of the cultists raised his head, as if he had sensed Louis' presence. His heart raced. He had been discovered. Without thinking, he began to move silently to a new hiding place, but another cult member, closer to him, stepped forward, looking directly at the tree where he was. Louis gripped his gun tightly, but knew he was at a disadvantage. The cultists began to approach, their chants growing in intensity. He felt the ground vibrate slightly under his feet, and the air around him became dense, as if it were being sucked into the circle of symbols. "You shouldn't have come," said a gruff voice from one of the hooded men. "Now you've become part of the ritual." Louis tried to remain calm, but the fear was palpable. "You won't get away with this. I already have enough evidence to put an end to you." The cultist in front of him took a step forward, laughing softly. "Evidence means nothing when no one can use it. And you'll see things you should never have seen." Before he could react, the cultist began to recite something in unison, and the energy in the air intensified. Louis felt a stabbing pain in his head, as if something was trying to invade his mind. He screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the chanting. He felt pulled towards the center of the circle, as if an invisible force was dragging him along. His vision began to blur, and he struggled to stay conscious, but the power emanating from the ritual was overwhelming. Just when he thought there was no hope, a shrill sound cut through the air, and a flash of light momentarily blinded him. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the pressure in his mind eased. Louis blinked, trying to clear his vision, and saw that something had changed. The cultists were paralyzed, looking towards the altar with shocked expressions. Louis forced himself to stand up and looked in the same direction. On the altar, the unconscious victim was now standing, but something was terribly wrong. The figure was shrouded in shadows that shouldn't have existed, as if it were absorbing the darkness around it. Its eyes were completely black, without a trace of humanity. The entity that had been summoned was now standing there in front of them. The cultists began to back away, muttering in panic, but it was too late. The entity raised a hand, and the shadows around it expanded, enveloping the cultists. What happened next was fast and terrifying. Louis couldn't clearly see what was happening, but the screams of pain and despair echoed through the cemetery as the entity consumed the cultists one by one. Louis knew he only had one chance to escape. Taking advantage of the chaos, he broke away, running as fast as his legs would allow. He didn't look back. He didn't want to see what was happening. All that mattered now was getting out alive. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally reached the road. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, but he knew he couldn't stop. He got in the car and sped off, driving along the deserted road as the first lights of morning began to appear on the horizon. When he finally felt safe enough to stop, he parked the car and sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. He had witnessed something that defied all comprehension, something that shouldn't exist. The cult was over, but the price had been too high. He knew that the story he had to tell was something that few would believe, but the evidence was there on his phone, and he knew he needed to share it with the world, regardless of the consequences. But as he gazed at the horizon, an unsettling question remained in his mind. The entity that had been summoned that night. Where was it now? Louis knew that his investigation had come to an end, but the real battle was perhaps just beginning. The first rays of the sun began to cross the horizon, casting a faint light on the road as Louis continued to drive, his eyes fixed on the horizon line. The adrenaline that had kept him going during the night was beginning to dissipate, leaving room for exhaustion and the shock of what he had witnessed. The images of the cemetery haunted his mind. The cultists being consumed by darkness, the entity that had been summoned, and the sound of the screams that still echoed in his ears. He knew he was safe, at least for the moment, but the feeling of danger wouldn't leave him. The cult had been destroyed, but the entity they had summoned was free, and Louis couldn't stop thinking about the possible consequences. He needed to find a safe place to stop, reorganize his thoughts, and decide what he would do next. After driving for some time, he spotted a small inn by the side of the road, a discreet place that seemed ideal for hiding and resting. He parked the car and, with heavy steps, entered the reception. The woman behind the counter gave him a friendly look without asking any questions. Louis mentally thanked her for her discretion and quickly grabbed a key, heading for the room she had indicated. As soon as he entered the room, he closed the door tightly, locking it and putting a chair under the doorknob, just in case. The room was small and simple, but it felt like a fortress to him at that moment. He threw himself on the bed, his body finally giving in to tiredness, but his mind was still active, processing the night's events. He took his phone out of his pocket and reviewed the recordings. The video captured everything: the ritual, the chants, the entity emerging from the shadows. It was incontrovertible proof of what had happened. Louis knew that these images had immense power, a power that could expose the truth to the world, but also one that could put him in even greater danger. As he watched the video, a doubt began to creep in. Who would believe him? Who would believe that a secret cult had managed to summon an entity from another world? Even with the evidence, he knew he would face skepticism and disbelief. But he had to try. He had to do his part to ensure that what happened that night would never happen again. Determined, he began to prepare a message, putting together the video and all the information he had collected during his investigation. He sent copies to a few trusted journalists and stored them on secure servers. The idea was simple. If anything happened to him, the truth would still come out. There was no going back. With the messages sent, Louis felt a brief moment of relief, but the feeling was quickly replaced by a disturbing emptiness. He had accomplished his goal, but what would come next? The cult was destroyed, but the entity remained free, and the guilt of having freed it weighed heavily on his conscience. Louis tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the entity emerging from the shadows again. The cultists' faces distorted by fear, the feeling that he had witnessed something that should never have been seen. He knew that, even if the world believed his story, the danger had not passed. The entity was out there, and no one knew what it was capable of. Hours passed, and the sun rose high in the sky, marking the beginning of a new day. Louis finally decided that he couldn't stay there forever. He needed to move on, find a new path, and perhaps one day the peace he so desperately craved. He picked up his things and left the room without looking back. When he got to his car, he felt a chill as he realized there was something on the windshield. A small envelope stuck under the wiper. His heart racing, Louis took out the envelope and opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message written in a handwriting he didn't recognize. "We're always watching. Don't think it's over." Louis felt the ground shake beneath his feet. Even with the cult apparently destroyed, there were others out there watching him, waiting for a slip-up. The threat hadn't disappeared. It had just changed form. He knew that his life would never be the same again. He got into his car and started the engine, feeling the familiar sense of urgency returning. The fight wasn't over, but he was prepared for whatever came next. Louis knew that he could no longer trust anyone, and that the only way forward was the one he himself would take. As he drove away, feeling the weight of constant danger on his shoulders, he couldn't help but wonder if he would ever find an end to this story. But one thing was certain: what had begun as a simple investigation had led him to a reality where terror knew no bounds, and where darkness seemed to have no end. And so Louis pressed on, determined to survive, determined to face whatever was lurking in the shadows. The Midnight Cult may have been destroyed, but the battle was far from won. The only certainty was that he was no longer fighting just the horrors of the world, but also the demons that now inhabited his own mind.